The maintenance crew arrived at Building 7 on a Tuesday morning in March 2019, expecting routine work. The brutalist concrete structure had stood empty on the edge of the University of Manitoba campus for 43 years, scheduled for demolition within the month. What they found in the sub-basement changed everything. The steel door was sealed. Not locked, sealed. Someone had welded it shut from the inside. The beadwork, crude but effective, as if done in desperate haste. When cutting torches finally breached the frame, the air that escaped carried the stale bite of decades-old confinement. Inside, they found a laboratory frozen in time, equipment arranged as if researchers had simply stepped away for lunch. Coffee cups still sat on benches. A jacket hung on a chair, and on every wall, covering every available surface, someone had written the same phrase hundreds of times in increasingly frantic handwriting. The frequency changed. We can't stop listening. 6 researchers entered that laboratory on November 18, 1976, as part of a classified acoustic study funded by the Canadian Defence Research Board. None of them ever came out. Their disappearance was quietly buried in bureaucratic files, the building sealed and forgotten, until that maintenance crew opened the door and discovered what had been hidden for over 4 decades. If you want to understand what happened in those final days, what could drive trained scientists to seal themselves underground and vanish without a trace, then stay with me. This is the story of an experiment that should never have been conducted, and the terrible price paid for pushing human perception beyond its natural limits. And if this story sends a chill down your spine, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really happened to the research team of Building 7. To understand the horror that unfolded in Building 7, we must first travel back to a different time, to the early autumn of 1976, when the laboratory still hummed with the routine optimism of scientific inquiry. Dr. Sarah Whitmore arrived at the University of Manitoba in September of that year, recruited specifically for the Defense Research Board's newest project. At 34, she was already establishing herself as one of North America's leading experts in auditory perception, having published groundbreaking work on how the human brain processes sound frequencies below the threshold of conscious hearing. Her research suggested that infrasound, acoustic waves too low for the human ear to detect, could still profoundly affect human physiology and psychology. The Canadian military was interested in this work for obvious reasons. The Cold War had entered its most paranoid phase, and both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations were exploring unconventional weapons. If infrasound could induce fear, disorientation, or compliance in enemy populations, it represented a strategic advantage worth billions. The Defense Research Board had secured funding for a 3-year study, and they wanted Whitmore to lead it. Building 7 was chosen for its isolation. Constructed in 1968 as part of the university's expansion, the brutalist structure sat at the furthest edge of campus, separated from other facilities by empty fields. Its sub-basement level was perfect for acoustic research. Concrete walls 3 feet thick, minimal vibration from surface traffic, and enough space to construct specialized sound chambers. The military installed their equipment over the summer. Industrial-grade speakers capable of producing frequencies as low as 0.5 hertz, sophisticated recording instruments, and, most importantly, an observation room with one-way glass where researchers could monitor test subjects without interference. Whitmore assembled her team carefully. Dr. Marcus Reed brought expertise in neurological responses, having spent 8 years studying how the brain's limbic system reacts to environmental stressors. Patricia Dumont, the team's senior technician, had worked at Bell Labs and understood the equipment better than anyone. James Kellerman was younger, fresh from his doctorate, but his background in signal processing made him invaluable. 2 graduate assistants rounded out the group, Michael Torres and Anne Blackwood, both in their mid-20s, both brilliant, both eager to contribute to what they believed would be groundbreaking research. They spent October setting up the laboratory, calibrating equipment, and establishing protocols. The work was meticulous and, by all accounts, proceeding exactly as planned. Whitmore filed weekly progress reports with the Defense Research Board, each one noting steady advancement toward their goal of mapping comprehensive human responses to infrasonic frequencies. The first human trials began on November 2nd, 1976. Volunteers from the university's psychology department sat in the sound chamber for 30-minute sessions while the team exposed them to various frequencies between 1 and 20 hertz. The results were immediately promising. At 7 hertz, subjects reported feelings of inexplicable anxiety. At 19 hertz, several described visual disturbances, shadows moving at the edge of their vision, even though the chamber was completely empty. These were exactly the kinds of responses Whitmore had predicted. The physiological effects her previous research had suggested existed. For 2 weeks, everything ran smoothly. The team worked long hours, but maintained good spirits. Building 7's isolation became a running joke among them. They called it the bunker and brought supplies in bulk, sometimes spending 12 or 14 hours underground without surfacing. The military liaison who checked on them weekly found nothing concerning. Progress was documented. Data was being collected. Science was being done. Then, on November 16th, something changed. Whitmore's report that week included a single anomalous note. They had detected an unexpected frequency in their recordings. Not one they had generated through their equipment, but something present in the ambient environment of the laboratory itself. A sound at 0.3 hertz, below even their speakers' capabilities, seemed to be resonating through the concrete structure. The note concluded with a decision to investigate further before the next scheduled trials. It was the last report Whitmore ever filed. 2 days later, on November 18th, the entire team descended into Building 7's sub-basement for what their logbook recorded as extended observation session. None of them returned. The first indication that something was wrong came on Friday, November 19th, when Dr. Whitmore failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with the university's Research Ethics Committee. She had never missed an appointment before. When calls to her office went unanswered, a colleague walked over to Building 7. He found the main doors unlocked, the ground floor deserted. Whitmore's office was dark, her coat still hanging on the rack. In the small kitchenette, someone had left a coffee pot on the burner. It had boiled dry, leaving a burnt smell throughout the corridor. The colleague felt a growing unease as he descended the stairs toward the sub-basement laboratory. The steel door at the bottom was closed, but unlocked. He opened it, called out, received no answer. The laboratory beyond was illuminated, but empty. Equipment hummed quietly. Lights glowed on control panels. Everything appeared normal except for one detail that he would later describe in his statement to campus security. All 6 personal belongings, coats, bags, car keys, were still present. Whatever had happened, the research team hadn't planned on leaving. Campus security conducted a cursory search and found nothing. The university contacted the Defense Research Board, who sent their liaison to investigate. He spent 2 hours in Building 7, reviewed the team's notes, and made several phone calls to Ottawa. Within 24 hours, military personnel arrived to secure the facility. The civilian authorities were thanked for their concern and politely excluded from further involvement. What followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic erasure. The Defense Research Board classified the project files, sealed Building 7, and informed the families that their loved ones had been working on sensitive research and had apparently abandoned their posts. Implications of voluntary departure were carefully suggested. Perhaps the stress of classified work had become too much. Perhaps they had walked away from obligations they couldn't handle. Without bodies, there could be no death certificates. Without evidence of foul play, there could be no criminal investigation. 6 people had simply vanished, and the official response was to shrug and lock the doors. For the families, this explanation was agonizing and insufficient. Sarah Whitmore's sister hired a private investigator who spent 6 months trying to gain access to Building 7 or the project files. He got nowhere. Marcus Reed's parents contacted their member of parliament, who made inquiries that vanished into the bureaucratic void. Patricia Dumont's husband organized a media campaign that briefly gained traction before the Defense Research Board invoked national security concerns, and newspapers lost interest. By 1978, the stories had faded. The families, exhausted and frustrated, had no choice but to move forward with their lives. Building 7 remained sealed, its contents classified. Occasionally, someone would ask what happened to the acoustic research team, but institutional memory is short, and soon there were very few people left at the university who even remembered the incident. The building itself became a kind of campus legend. Students walking past the brutalist structure after dark would sometimes dare each other to approach its doors, swearing they could hear sounds from within, though this was surely imagination or wind through the ventilation grates. A groundskeeper reported that lights sometimes flickered in the sub-basement windows, visible at ground level if you knew where to look. His supervisor told him the building was empty and he should stop making up stories. Year after year, Building 7 stood unchanged. Paint peeled. Weeds grew against its foundation. The concrete aged poorly, developing cracks and water damage. In the 1990s, there was brief discussion of demolishing the structure, but asbestos concerns and unclear ownership made the project too expensive. The building remained, a cold monument to something the government had decided should be forgotten. What no one knew, what wouldn't be discovered until 2019, was that the laboratory had never been truly empty. Deep in the sub-basement, behind that steel door, something had been preserved. A crime scene, perhaps. Or something stranger. A final testament to what happens when human curiosity pushes into territories where human minds were never meant to venture. When the maintenance crew finally breached that door 43 years later, they found a laboratory that told a very different story than the one the government had been telling all those years. The recordings were the key to everything. When the maintenance crew opened the laboratory in 2019, they discovered that the team's equipment had remained running all those years. Not every system. Power had been cut to the building in 1982, but the battery-backed recording devices had continued functioning long after the researchers vanished, capturing audio until their power finally died sometime in the early 1980s. Modern forensic analysts transferred those recordings to digital format and began the painstaking work of listening through hundreds of hours of material. What they reconstructed was a timeline of the team's final week, a descent into something that defied easy explanation. The recordings from November 16th showed normal research operations. Whitmore's voice was clear and professional as she conducted trials, narrating observations for the record. The anomalous frequency she had mentioned in her final report appeared at 1437 that afternoon, a deep, almost subliminal tone that the sensitive equipment captured even though the human ear could barely register it. Whitmore noted it immediately. "Are we generating that?" she asked Patricia Dumont. The technician's response, "Negative. All our systems are offline right now. That's coming from somewhere else." November the 17th was when concern became fascination. The team spent the day trying to locate the source of the 0.3 Hz frequency. Marcus Reed hypothesized it might be geological. Manitoba's bedrock occasionally produced minor seismic activity that could generate infrasound. But the frequency was too consistent, too precise. It didn't vary like a natural phenomenon. It felt, as James Kellerman put it on the recording, almost artificial. The younger researcher, Michael Torres, made an observation that evening that seemed to unsettle the others. "Has anyone else noticed that you can kind of feel it? Not hear it, but feel it. Like it's inside your chest." There was a pause on the recording before Anne Blackwood admitted, "Yes, like a pressure. I've been feeling it all day." They should have left then. They should have sealed the laboratory, reported the anomaly, and let someone else investigate. But scientists are cursed with curiosity, and Whitmore made the decision to stay and document the phenomenon. "This is exactly what we've been studying," her voice on the recording reasoned. environmental infrasound affecting human physiology. We have an opportunity here to observe it firsthand, under controlled conditions. November 18th began with what sounded like routine work, the team discussing how to properly measure and characterize the mysterious frequency. But as the hours passed, subtle changes appeared in the recordings. Voices became slightly strained. There were longer pauses in conversation. Someone, it sounded like Patricia Dumont, commented around noon, "Is anyone else having trouble concentrating? I keep losing track of what I'm doing." At 15:22, the recording captured a sound that the forensic analysts initially thought was a technical malfunction, a series of rhythmic pulses that seemed to oscillate in and out of the audible range. But it wasn't a malfunction. It was the 0.3 hertz frequency suddenly amplifying, growing stronger, becoming impossible to ignore, even for unassisted human hearing. Marcus Reed's voice, tight with controlled alarm, "Sarah, the amplitude is increasing. Whatever's generating this, it's getting stronger." And then, at 16:47, Anne Blackwood said something that appeared in the transcript as incoherent syllables. When linguistic experts analyzed the recording, they realized she was speaking normally, or trying to, but her words were being modulated by the infrasonic waves passing through the laboratory. The acoustic pressure was physically distorting her vocal cords, making speech nearly impossible. The last clear exchange on the recording came at 17:30. James Kellerman, "We need to leave. Now. Something's wrong." Whitmore's response, "We can't open the door. Listen." In the background of that recording, barely perceptible, was a sound that the forensic team described as oscillating pressure waves of extreme amplitude. The frequency had grown so powerful that it was creating physical vibrations throughout Building 7. Anyone trying to climb the stairs to move through that acoustic environment would have experienced immediate physiological effects: vertigo, nausea, potential loss of consciousness. They were trapped, not by locks or barriers, but by sound itself. And whatever was generating that frequency was still growing stronger. What happened next was documented not in audio, but in the physical evidence left behind. Evidence that the 2019 investigation team photographed and cataloged with growing disquiet. The walls told the first part of the story. Someone had begun writing on them in black marker, noting observations in increasingly deteriorated handwriting. The earliest notes, dated November 18th evening, were scientific in nature. Frequency now measurable at 0.28 hertz, amplitude approximately 95 dB. Physiological effects include pressure in chest cavity, difficulty with equilibrium, mild auditory hallucinations. But as the hours passed, the observations became more disturbing. Can't reach the door. Pressure too intense. Michael tried climbing stairs. Fell. Possible concussion. Then, not a hallucination. We can all hear it now. Not the frequency itself, but something in the frequency, like voices, like it's trying to communicate. The investigators found Marcus Reed's notebook on one of the laboratory benches. His final entry suggested a man trying desperately to apply scientific reasoning to an experience that defied it. He had sketched diagrams of the human ear with notes about bone conduction and resonance frequencies. One passage read, "If sound can carry information, what happens when the carrier wave operates below conscious perception? The information might bypass our rational filters entirely. Direct access to the limbic system, to the primitive brain. We're not hearing something. We're being reprogrammed by it." The recording equipment had captured fragments of conversation from November 19th, though much of it was distorted by the overwhelming acoustic environment. Patricia Dumont's voice, barely intelligible, "Sealed us in. Deliberate. It knows we're here." And later, possibly, James Kellerman, "Can't tell which thoughts are mine anymore." But the most haunting evidence was found on the walls near the sealed door. In the final hours, someone, likely multiple people, had written the same phrase over and over, sometimes in print, sometimes in cursive, sometimes scratched with fingernails when writing implements apparently ran out. The frequency changed. We can't stop listening. Forensic analysis suggested this writing had been done over a period of approximately 12 hours. Hundreds of repetitions of the same sentence, covering every available surface. The handwriting grew progressively more erratic, the letters larger and less controlled. In the final iterations, scrawled near the bottom of the door itself, the writing was barely legible. The hand that produced it was clearly operating under extreme duress. And then, nothing. The laboratory fell silent on the recordings sometime in the early morning hours of November the 20th. The equipment continued running, but no human voices appeared on the audio, no footsteps, no sound of breathing, just the ever-present infrasonic frequency pulsing endlessly through the concrete chamber, and occasional creaks and groans as the building settled around the sealed room. The question that haunted the 2019 investigators was simple and terrible. Where did they go? 6 bodies worth of organic matter doesn't simply vanish. The laboratory showed no signs of violence, no blood, no indication of any physical struggle beyond the scattered equipment suggesting people had fallen or stumbled. The sealed door had been welded from inside. Crude beadwork suggesting someone with access to the laboratory's welding equipment had created a barrier that took cutting torches 43 years later to breach. Why seal themselves in? What were they trying to keep out or prevent from getting out? One detail troubled the forensic team more than any other. When they examined the walls where that phrase had been written hundreds of times, they found skin cells in the dried ink and graphite. DNA testing confirmed what they had begun to suspect. All 6 researchers had participated in writing those messages. Whitmore, Reed, Dumont, Kellerman, Torres, Blackwood, all had taken turns writing the same phrase over and over. 6 trained scientists acting in unison, covering every surface with the same words, as if they had stopped being 6 individuals and had become something else. A chorus responding to a frequency only they could fully perceive. The investigation that followed the 2019 discovery was extensive, but ultimately inconclusive. Multiple agencies became involved: the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, federal authorities, independent forensic specialists, and eventually researchers from universities across Canada who wanted to understand what had happened from a scientific perspective. The Defense Research Board files were partially declassified. They revealed that the acoustic research project had been more ambitious than even the university had known. The military hadn't just been interested in infrasound as a weapon, they had been exploring whether certain frequencies could be used for communication, whether acoustic waves below conscious hearing could carry information directly into the human nervous system. The implications were staggering: a communications method that couldn't be intercepted, decoded, or resisted. Sound as a direct pathway into human consciousness. But the files also revealed something the research team hadn't known. Building 7 had been built on the site of an older structure. In the 1930s, the same location had housed an industrial testing facility for mining equipment. The facility had closed abruptly in 1938 after several workers reported psychological episodes, hallucinations, paranoia, reports of hearing voices. A brief investigation at the time had attributed these incidents to carbon monoxide exposure from diesel engines, and the facility was demolished. When the university built Building 7 3 decades later, no one thought to examine why that earlier structure had been abandoned. A geological survey conducted in 2019 found something remarkable. The bedrock beneath Building 7 had unusual acoustic properties. A natural cavity system, shaped by water erosion over millennia, created a resonance chamber nearly 100 feet below the surface. Under normal circumstances, this would be irrelevant. But when the research team's equipment had been running, when they had been generating powerful infrasonic waves in the sub-basement laboratory, they had apparently excited this natural resonance cavity. The 0.3 hertz frequency they detected hadn't been something they generated. It was the bedrock itself responding to their experiments, vibrating like a massive tuning fork. But this didn't explain what had happened to the researchers. It didn't explain the sealed door, the repetitive writing, the complete disappearance of 6 human beings from a locked room. Acoustic resonance, no matter how powerful, doesn't make people vanish. Some theories emerged, each more unsettling than the last. One suggested that extreme infrasonic pressure could have induced a mass psychotic break, causing the researchers to harm themselves in ways the evidence didn't reveal. Perhaps they had sealed themselves in the walls, or found ways to destroy their bodies that left no obvious trace. But this theory had problems. The laboratory was thoroughly examined. No concealed spaces were found. No chemical residues suggesting body disposal. The room was exactly as it appeared, an abandoned laboratory where 6 people had simply ceased to exist. Another theory proposed that the researchers were still alive somewhere, having found an exit that the 2019 team had missed. But this made even less sense. Where would they have gone? Why would they have disappeared so completely, leaving behind all identification, never contacting families, vanishing for 43 years? And why seal the door behind them if they had escaped? A third theory, rarely discussed in official reports but whispered about among the investigators, was the most disturbing. That the frequency had changed them so fundamentally that they stopped being physical beings as we understand them. That sound waves, at precisely the right amplitude and frequency, had somehow translated human consciousness into a different state, not death, not life, but something else entirely. This theory was scientifically absurd, of course, but so was the entire situation. The university demolished Building 7 in December 2019, carefully documenting every stage of the process. When they excavated the sub-basement, they found the bedrock cavity exactly where the geological survey had predicted. They also found something else, scoring marks on the stone floor directly beneath where the laboratory had stood, as if something had been dragging or scraping against the rock. The marks were fresh, not geologically old. They appeared to have been made sometime in the intervening 43 years, in the sealed darkness below the abandoned building. No one could explain what had caused them. No animal could have accessed that space. No natural process produced marks in that particular pattern. The excavation team photographed the scoring and then filled the cavity with concrete, sealing it permanently. Today, the site where Building 7 stood is an empty field on the edge of the University of Manitoba campus. A small memorial plaque installed in 2020 commemorates the 6 researchers who disappeared. It provides their names, notes that they were lost during scientific research in 1976, and asks those who passed to remember their dedication to advancing human knowledge. It doesn't mention the sealed door, the mysterious frequency, or the hundreds of repetitions of that final, desperate message. The families received some closure, though perhaps not the kind they had hoped for. Death certificates were finally issued in 2020, 44 years after the disappearances. The official cause of death was listed as accident during classified research, which explained nothing but at least provided legal finality. Several families pursued civil litigation against the Defense Research Board for negligence, cases that were quietly settled out of court with non-disclosure agreements. The scientific community has been reluctant to discuss Building 7 in any detail. The incident raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of certain types of research, about the dangers of pushing human subjects, even willing researcher subjects, into extreme sensory environments without fully understanding the risks. Some universities have reviewed their protocols for acoustic research as a result, implementing more stringent safety requirements. But there's something else, something that those who have carefully studied the evidence can't quite articulate. It's the sense that what happened in Building 7 wasn't simply a tragic accident. That the researchers discovered something real, something that exists in the space between what we can consciously perceive and what our bodies respond to at a deeper level. Sound is vibration, and vibration is information, and information can change things in ways we're only beginning to understand. In 2023, a graduate student at McGill University conducting research on human perception of infrasound reported an unusual finding in her data. During controlled trials using frequencies between 0.1 and 0.5 hertz, several subjects claimed to experience a phenomenon they described as contact with something beyond normal awareness. When pressed for details, they struggled to articulate the experience, but consistently used words like presence, communication, and most disturbingly, listening. The graduate student discontinued the research and changed her thesis focus. That same year, maintenance workers at a laboratory in Sweden reported hearing rhythmic sounds coming from inside the walls of their acoustic testing facility, sounds present only when their equipment was offline, sounds that seemed to come from the building's structure itself. A brief investigation found nothing. The sounds eventually stopped. Whether these incidents are connected to what happened in Building 7, whether they represent the same phenomenon reaching across decades and distance, is impossible to know. What we do know is that sound travels. It moves through materials, through air, through rock and bone, and the deep places beneath our feet where we have built our laboratories and our instruments and our careful experiments. And sometimes, perhaps, sound travels back. The research team that disappeared in 1976 left behind one final message, written hundreds of times on laboratory walls. The frequency changed. We can't stop listening. Maybe they discovered that listening is not a passive act, that when you tune your consciousness to certain frequencies, certain depths of perception, you might encounter something that listens back, something that has always been there, vibrating in the spaces between what we can hear and what we can comprehend, waiting for someone to finally tune in to the right wavelength. The laboratory is gone now, the building demolished, the cavity beneath sealed with concrete. But sound travels and frequencies persist, and in the deep places beneath our feet, something might still be resonating, still waiting, still listening for the next curious mind that pushes just a little too far into the places where human perception meets something vaster and older and entirely indifferent to the small, fragile creatures who briefly mistook understanding for safety. The 6 researchers of Building 7 learned a truth that we prefer not to acknowledge, that reality extends far beyond what our senses show us, and that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only survived, if we're lucky enough to turn back before we hear the frequency change, before we become unable to stop listening, before we cross from the world we know into the resonance that waits beneath it all, patient and vast and forever beyond our understanding, or beyond our